Thank you very much. I'm happy to be with you today. And I'm particularly happy about this format of a debate because it really allows both sides, diverse issues to be voiced and for people to be able to challenge different views. So I'm grateful to be here. I'll try to say why Palestinian civil society reached the conclusion that we need to resort to a boycott, divestment, and sanctions campaign against Israel. What's the international setting that led to this? What exactly is this BDS campaign? What is it calling for? There's a lot of misunderstanding about what BDS is and what it's not. And then I'll come to the end and explain some of the issues that are complex, that are challenges that face us in our work, some of the successes we faced in this work, and I'll conclude with that. The Palestinian boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement was launched in 2005, a year after the International Court of Justice at The Hague decided that Israel's settlements and wall built illegally on Palestinian occupied territory must be torn down, and it urged the international community not to cooperate in any way in perpetuating the settlements and the wall. However, the international community has not heeded the ICJ ruling, the advisory opinion of the ICJ of 2004. A year after that, the Palestinian civil society, which means unions, political forces, women's groups, feminists, students, everyone, NGOs and so on, got together and issued the boycott, divestment, and sanctions call. A year after the ICJ ruling went unheeded, ignored completely. We felt that the international community has failed miserably to hold Israel to account. For decades, Israel's occupation, colonization have continued. Israel's apartheid, and this is a loaded term, so I'll explain that a bit later, has continued for decades, despite that the international community has not been able to do anything. Palestinians were being increasingly dispossessed, losing our livelihoods, our resources, our land, and slowly and gradually being ethnically cleansed from our own homeland. So we had to resort to a civil form of struggle that people can understand everywhere, based solely on international law and human rights principles, nothing else. So in the BDS movement, we do not adopt a political solution. Each one of us does. But within that movement, we have a consensus on 3 basic rights, and we do not go beyond that. The 3 basic rights correspond to the 3 basic forms of oppression and injustices that we are subjected to. First, the occupation. We call for ending Israel's occupation, 1967 occupation, and colonization. By the 1967, we mean Gaza, the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. The second, we call for ending the system, the institutionalized, legalized system of racial discrimination inside Israel against its non-Jewish citizens. Inside Israel, there's a 2-tier legal system, one for Jewish citizens and one for non-Jewish citizens. So every human right deserves equal rights, including in Israel, including any other country. The third and most important issue that we call for is the right of return for refugees. This is the most basic, fundamental right of refugees everywhere in the world. In any conflict, refugees always, according to international law, have a right to return to their homes. This is not something special for the Palestinians. This is sanctioned by the United Nations in General Assembly Resolution 194. So these are the 3 basic rights that we call for. Now, the BDS movement, since it was launched in 2005, was able to reach, with its universalist message, international law of human rights, was able to reach many unions, particularly in the West, in South Africa, and in other countries, Latin America, East Asia, and so on. But it really took off after the Israeli illegal war of aggression on Gaza, end of 2008, early 2009. In that war, Israel crossed many red lines. It committed many war crimes that were described by international law experts as war crimes, by UN officials, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and so on. Some UN officials went as far as saying Israel committed war crimes against humanity, and that includes Richard Falk, the current UN Rapporteur for Human Rights in the occupied Palestinian territory, and he happens to be Jewish. He's a professor of international law at Princeton. By contributing to Israel's blockade of Gaza, and its illegal war of aggression against Gaza, the US and other Western states have reached a qualitatively different stage of complicity. They moved from collusion in a deliberate Israeli policy of de-development, according to Harvard professor Sarah Roy, to undermining the very rule of law, so that the rule of law has disappeared and we're under the law of the jungle. Might makes right. But Gaza aside, Palestinian civil society and a growing number of influential human rights advocates recognize that Israel's regime over the indigenous people of Palestine constitutes occupation, colonization, and apartheid. What is it with this apartheid word? Because that sticks out usually. As far as the 1967 occupied territory, there's an increasing number of people who call Israel's policies, and as not just occupation but also apartheid. Those include Desmond Tutu, Jimmy Carter, former UN officials, and so on, John Dugard, and so on. Even Israeli Attorney General Michael Ben Yair wrote in 2002 in Haaretz the following, quote, about the 1967 territory, we enthusiastically chose to become a colonial society, ignoring international treaties, expropriating lands, transferring settlers from Israel to the occupied territories, engaging in theft and finding justification for all these activities. In effect, we established an apartheid regime in the occupied territories. This is a very high-ranking Israeli official. Palestinian research into the matter went further, showing that the policies of apartheid apply not just to Palestinians in the occupied territories, but also Palestinian citizens of Israel. But why do we call it apartheid? I mean, Israel is not like South Africa. There are so many differences. South Africa does not define the term apartheid. South Africa was a very important case of apartheid, but apartheid is a generalized crime. The UN in 1976, at a convention for the suppression and punishment of the crime of apartheid, defined what apartheid is, what the crime of apartheid is. So when we say that Israel is practicing apartheid, we do not have to prove an analogy with South Africa. We just have to go through Israeli policies and laws and regulations and parliament laws and decisions and say, does this fit with the UN definition of apartheid or not? According to many studies, including a very recent academic study at South Africa, sponsored by the government of South Africa, Israel is indeed practicing apartheid, at least they recognize in one part of the 1967 occupied territory, and we see it as extending beyond that. So what is the BDS campaign calling for? It's calling for ending those injustices. How? Through boycotting Israeli products, Israeli services, Israeli institutions, as well as institutions that are complicit in Israel's occupation and apartheid policies. So, for example, the US campaign to end the Israeli occupation, which is a huge coalition in the US here, has called for boycotting Motorola, because Motorola supplies the communication system to the Israeli army, and they supplied several other things as well. That's just one example. So it's not just Israeli companies, it's also international companies involved in profiting from the occupation. BDS also has the D, divestment. Divesting from companies, Israeli companies, international companies profiting from the occupation, and so on. Churches, unions, pension funds, we're urging everyone to divest from the occupation, to divest from oppression. Finally, sanctions, which is a state form of punitive measure. And that comes at the end. No wonder it's B, D, and then S, because governments usually do not take decisions like that very lightly. While moral consistency and commitment to universal rights are the overriding principles of the global BDS movement, operationally, BDS is based on three basic principles: context sensitivity, gradualness, and sustainability. So it's not a one-size-fits-all. It really depends on the context. In a particular context, some groups that support us, some Jewish groups, for example, in the US, say, oh, we cannot take the whole BDS call. We can do a boycott of Ahava, an Israeli cosmetics company that manufactures in a settlement. We can do that. Code Pink, for example, if some of you have heard of it. So they